Hi, Misha here, and we've been moving through Russian tanks, and we talked about several of the self-propelled guns, artillery, mortar, howitzers used by the Russian army, inherited from the Soviet Union. And this time I thought we would talk about three pieces of armor that were air-droppable, used by the Soviet air forces, the VDV, the airborne, the paratroopers, if you will, because I just found these quite interesting. And as usual, 1/72 scale from Fabry Eaglemoss, because they're the only ones that have ever done these. Here we have the ASU57, and then the larger ASU85, and then finally we have the 2S9. This is an air-droppable mortar, and I thought it would be better to include it in this video instead of the one I did earlier on the self-propelled guns. So let's get into it. So here we have the ASU57 onto the spinny thing, and it is small. So I don't know if when I set it down like this, it's really going to capture it or the wall, but c'est la vie. This is interesting because it was really designed for the VDV. They really gained an importance and usefulness during World War II. So after the war, two design bureaus were tasked with making an air-droppable piece for them. You could call this a tankette, you could call it an anti-tank gun, you could even call it light artillery. The idea was to give the airborne some support that could drop in with them. Of course, keep in mind, in the late 40s, aircraft didn't have the capacity like they would later on, so it needed to be light. And there were two design bureaus. You had Astrov and you had Koroktejev, and they just worked using World War II design. Starting from there. Koroktejev had worked on a lighter vehicle. I think it was called the K-71. And it had very thin armor. And it used a high velocity but small bore 57mm gun. Astrov went a little bigger. They kind of started off with the T-70 light tank that we've talked about, and the ASU56 anti-tank gun we've also talked about, blending the two with an updated version of the 76.2mm gun. And still, while light, it had more armor. The Design Bureau, they both submitted their designs in around 1948-49, and both were rejected. The original Astrov design was too heavy, and the K-71 was simply too light and unusable by the standards at the time. However, the Astrov design was felt to have more going on, and they were told to rework it, and this would become Object 172. And they essentially blended. They removed the 76mm gun, and they installed the most recent version of the 57mm gun, and they kind of compromised on the armor and size. And after testing, these were approved for limited production in 1950 and then accepted into the VDV in 1951. And they would deploy about 54 of these per division, giving armor support on the battlefield, which did seem like a good idea. I mean, it wasn't a bad idea, but they were very constrained by the lifting equipment of the time, namely the Antonov AN-12. The lifting, they couldn't have much. So this is a very small and light craft. It's under 3.5 tons, and it's right around 3.5 meters long. It actually uses a gasoline engine taken from a car, and has a top speed of about 45 kilometers per hour. It has a crew of 3. We've got a driver, he's in the front, and we have a commander slash gunner, double duty, and a loader who incidentally faces backwards. It can also carry a couple of troops kind of riding on the back if needs be, which is, not bad for airborne. They can hitch a ride. I guess 45 kilometers per hour is better than walking. Now the main gun is a 57 millimeter, and there were 30 rounds for it, and they just kind of stowed them wherever they could find space on board the vehicle. The kind of thing, the armor, very lightly armored, but it was one of the very first vehicles to have a composite armor in aluminum alloy to try to save on weight. It was sloped, but it was only about 6 millimeters, maybe 10 millimeters in a few critical areas. So it could not defend against any kind of cannon shells, big splinters, even 50 caliber machine gun rounds. It was just there to protect against small arms fire and small pieces of shrapnel. It really didn't matter because this was an open top design. Now this model here kind of has a canvas cover, which would be how it would be dropped. But that would be taken off, and so yeah, this gave great visibility, but it also made it vulnerable, just like the ASU56 was in World War II. On the other hand, it had a few things standard. For example, it had a radio as standard equipment, kind of important. And it had quite good mobility and cross-country performance, although because of its size, it carried not a whole lot of gasoline, so its range was only 200 to 250 kilometers before it needed a top off. There would be some improvements. For example, in 1957, the gun would be improved, and they would give it a shorter, more effective muzzle brake. And they would update the radio in the early 60s, and they would also start to provide night vision, at least early night vision, for the crew. Although, not much chance of NBC protecting an open-topped vehicle. They also gave it a mount where either a 7.62 DTM machine gun or later a 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun could be mounted. This was for defense against infantry and some light air defense. This was always kind of an optional feature beginning in the 60s, though it wasn't standard. Production had been run from the 1950, the pre-production batch, up to about 1962. Because by this time, the 57 millimeter gun just couldn't punch through modern armor, and they knew that. It didn't really have combat experience while in Soviet service, even during production. The first time the ASU57 would see combat would be in 1967 in Egyptian hands during the 6 Days War against Egypt. They would also be given in small numbers to East Germany and North Korea. And in the 70s, some would be given away to African nations, namely Ethiopia, and they would see some use, including even being dropped by air units in that time. And by this time, the Mi-6, the MIL Mi-6 helicopter, could actually drop one of these because of how small and light they were. But yeah, its days were pretty well numbered just because it's a 57 millimeter gun. The Russians quickly realized, wow, this was interesting. It was a holdover from World War II. Everything about it was just not up for that modern battlefield. As we said in lots of videos, by the 60s, they wanted everything to be buttoned up, NBC protected, because that was kind of part of Soviet combat battlefield doctrine. So these were being pulled out of service in the 60s, and by the 70s, they were virtually out of the VDV. And few other nations would inherit them secondhand and use them, but these typically were third world nations. And that's kind of it. But it did set the groundwork for our next vehicle. The ASU85. By the way, ASU is essentially Air-Droppable Unit. Air-Droppable Self-Prepared Unit. One thing I didn't mention about our 57 over here, when these are dropped, they would kind of come off on a pallet. and use a parachute and later a single rocket so they wouldn't completely smash into the Earth. This is another project of the Astrov Design Bureau design team, and it started off as Object 573. And it actually started off as something for the standard infantry, and work began right after the Object 572 in 1951. And it started off based on the PT-76 light tank, but like World War II anti-tank guns, artillery, it was open-topped, and it was diesel-powered, uses the PT-76's engine, but it wasn't amphibious, and it was using the up-to-date version of the 85mm gun seen on the T-34 and many others. The first couple of prototypes were ready by 1953. They went through testing, and already some changes were needed. For example, they went to a new version of the engine, and they would produce more prototypes, so these would go through state testing in 1956, and they liked what they saw, but they didn't like the open-top design. This was right when they were thinking about making all new vehicles NBC protected. So even though they ordered it into production, they ordered some more changes, including giving it an armored roof and kind of buttoning it up a bit. So while production officially began in 1958, it really wasn't until 1960 or even 1962 that full rate was achieved because of them making some last-minute changes. So you can kind of see on this model where they just slapped on a roof as such. Now again, this was originally designed for the infantry. However, by the 1960s, when it was ready to go, they didn't need it. They had other things and were developing other things, so infantry use was quite limited. Also, interestingly, it was officially adopted as the ASU85M. There was already an ASU85M. No one seemed to care. So, yeah, they used the same name. But very little use, very little interest from the regular ground pounders. But the VDV, on the other hand, they were looking for something new. Around this time, they were working on advanced air-droppable systems, bigger pallets that use multiple chutes, multiple rockets. They were getting increasingly heavier, more lift-capable aircraft, and even helicopters like the Mi-6 I mentioned and the Mi-10. And the ASU57 was starting to show its age. So they became interested, and eventually the only user buying, or ordering, I should say, the ASU85M. Thus, the name was officially changed to ASU85 around 1966-1967, and production would continue for a brief time, ending in the 70s. But this would equip airborne divisions. They would typically have about 31 per division. It was not intended as an anti-tank gun as such. It was more mobile light artillery and infantry support. But it had a lot more going on for it than the previous ASU57. This is a much larger design. It's about 8.5 meters long with the main gun, and it's about 15.5 tons, so much bigger. It also has a lot more armor going on, anywhere from 30 to 45 millimeters thickness. Obviously it has the roof we talked about, has a crew of 4 now, so the poor commander doesn't have to do double duty as gunner, and it carries more ammunition. Even though this is a larger 85mm gun, it carries up to 45 rounds on board. It also has a coaxially mounted machine gun as standard. Early versions, it was a 7.62 SGMT. Later versions, this was upgraded to a 7.62 PKT, the Kalashnikov type. A radio was standard. Night vision was standard for the crew. And it had about the same top speed, 45 kilometers per hour, and about the same range, 200 to 250 kilometers. And this had a diesel engine, not gasoline. There's certain advantages to that, to be sure. And they were actually able to successfully airdrop these because of advancements in technology. You can see the spotlight on board too. It was a much more capable gun. Standard range was about 1 kilometer, maybe 1.25 kilometers. Standard shooting range. It could go further, of course, but things kind of dropped off after that because this is still a relatively small gun. And these would mostly be used by Russia, but they would be given to several allies, including Poland. They would use these in pretty large numbers for a decade or so. Wanted to put these side by side to really drive home how much larger the ASU85 is compared to the ASU57. Yeah, as the 57 was being phased out, the ASU85 was becoming more and more common in the VDV throughout the 70s. And while the Russians never used the 57 in combat, they used the 85 extensively throughout the 80s in Afghanistan. And it did okay against those kind of targets. The mobility and flexibility, giving armor support to airdropped troops, and the more modern planes could keep up with them. And it would actually stay in service, finally being retired after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1993. What really replaced it was the improvements based on the BDM. The BDM-1 wasn't too much of a threat to the 85 as far as its place in the military, but the BDM-2, with its improved armament, was giving it a run for its money. And when the BDM-3, which was essentially the same thing as the BDM-4, came along, that could basically do the job of this, plus carry troops, and just was a more flexible platform. So, days were numbered, but this was very much a product of the Cold War, and it definitely appears as such. And with that, let's look at our last air-droppable vehicle. The 2S9 NONA, or NANA, which is kind of an acronym standing for Newest Ordnance of the Ground Artillery. I could have included this in the previous video, but it just seemed to kind of fit better here. Plus that video was getting longer. And this is actually the one of the three that's still in service today. And what's interesting to me, and the reason I like this little model, it's based on the hull of the BTRD, which was the lightweight air-droppable infantry fighting vehicle that the VDV used. Now, for whatever reason, there does not seem to be a Fabry Eaglemoss model of just a straight BTRD, but they have this, and you can definitely see kind of the way it's split in the back and just everything where it's coming from. So when the BTRD was introduced in 1974, this is when work began on this critter here. And the earliest prototypes would be around 1979, and it was officially in full service by 1981. This could be used by the VDV. It could also be used by mobile ground forces, especially those operating behind enemy lines, because this is a very mobile craft. It is capable of up to 60 kilometers per hour on road. It's capable of up to 9 kilometers over water using the water jet system, so not the tracks. And it's, of course, air-droppable. And it's an interesting hybrid. It's mortar and howitzer. It can do direct or indirect fire because we have a 120 millimeter gun that is rifled, breech loaded, but it can be used as a mortar as well. It can fire high explosive. It can fire a few other different types of ammunition. and it carries anywhere from 40 to 60, depending on exactly what type. It can also have laser-guided rounds, at least later versions of the 2S9 can fire those. And it has a 7.62 PKT machine gun coax mounted for defense. Now the hull is lightweight aluminum alloy. The two-person turret is welded steel construction. It is NBC protected, the usual stuff, night vision, crew of 4, driver, commander, gunner, loader. Pretty standard there. It's just a hair shy of 9 tons, and it's a little over 6 meters long. Part of it is we have a relatively short, barrel, so it doesn't stick out much. And it has greater range than the previous two, about 500 kilometers, so it doesn't need topping off as much. It's a pretty versatile vehicle, and was introduced in the 80s, used in Afghanistan, and has been updated and modernized throughout the Russian forces post-Soviet today. I just think it's kind of neat. Again, it's an interesting idea to have a multi-purpose howitzer mortar dropping in with the VDV, or just used kind of by mobile ground pounders as such. They have around 250, 300 in active service today, with another 500 in reserve in Russia. These weren't produced in huge numbers, but around 1,000 were made. Very specialized vehicle. The only thing I can say, it doesn't really have much armor protection like the rest of the 2S series we've talked about. You're looking at 10, 15, maybe 20 millimeter armor at most, so it definitely falls down there compared with the ASU85, but then again, the ASU85 weighs several tons more. But, yeah, neat. And you can definitely see the heritage with the BTR series in the hull, and even turret to some extent. So what do you think? I've been hoping and planning to have time to do these videos for a while. Finally just buckled down and did it. I don't know, I just find them interesting. And funny thing is about the models, you might find that this little one is a ripoff because it's the same price as the others, but what's kind of funny, it's probably the heaviest. It's all metal except for the rubber tracks and the little main gun and the simulated canvas roof, but the whole hull is metal. It's actually very little heavy little thing. The 85 is pretty neat too. Of course, no turret to move on this, so it just has the main gun. But with the Nana, the turret does move. It's a little bit lighter. This is metal. Turret's plastic. I'd say it's the lightest of all of these, maybe even compared to the 57. So yeah, I hope you're enjoying this series. It seemed apropos to talk about what was in Soviet service and is in Russian and other breakaway and former USSR states service, because they made these in large numbers. And the thing is, while they're not the most advanced in the world as far as the technology, they were built to last and to be easy to maintain. And I think we really do see that today, that so many old Soviet vehicles are still running. Yeah, even though the 2S9 production ended around 1989, 1990, like I said, there are still several hundred in service in Russia today, and a few here and there in other states that inherited them afterwards. So, yeah, with that, I appreciate you hanging out with me. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.